All right, I want to just like do some very, very quick stage setting. I thought this morning's findings were sobering. We're in kind of a unique moment. ESSER came up briefly, but I just want to mention that this is, $190 billion. I think that we typically spend between $800 and $900 billion on K-12 education. So I can't do the math exactly, but we're talking 25% of what we typically spend is what the school districts have over for a short runway, because as someone said, maybe it was Elise, the money has to be allocated by, I believe it's September 2024, spent out, about a year later, a little bit longer. So I think that is one of the things that makes this a unique moment, that there's a great need and there are unprecedented resources. And then the other thing that I think makes it sort of a unique moment is that it feels like there's a bit of a vacuum in terms of what is the next thing. So many of you in this room have been involved in education, research, policy, advocacy, during the No Child Left Behind era, the Obama era, which in some ways may have altered, but sort of kept the consensus around standards and testing and accountability. And then ESSA, which sort of backed off, from a lot of what No Child Left Behind had originally established. So it feels, to me at least, like we're in a little bit of a vacuum about what policy is going to look like going forward. So in this next session, we're going to be talking about all of those things with a look back, but look back to try and think about going forward lens. And I'm excited about the folks that we have to talk about that. And I'm just going to introduce them. So we have Mohammed Choudhury, who is the state superintendent from Maryland. And before Mohammed was the state sup, he was the chief innovation officer from San Antonio Independent Schools. Before that, he was the founding director of the Office of Transformation and Innovation in Dallas. And before that, if I remember correctly, without glancing down at my notes, which are hard to read, I believe you are a middle school teacher. Yeah. And to Mohammed's right is Claire Abbott, who is the Director of Educational Effectiveness for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE. And I've had the pleasure to know and work with Claire for a number of years. But Claire oversees state policy and resources around teacher preparation and licensure. And then to Claire's right is Andy Rotherham. And Andy is the maybe year-long appointee to the State Board of Education in Virginia, but recently got the stamp of approval, right? And also is the founding director of Bellwether Education. And I think I probably first knew of Andy from EduWonk, which had to be one of the very first education blogs, if not the first. Yeah, it's been a long time. And then, of course, you all know Rick from this morning. So I'm looking forward to a good conversation. When I was talking to Andy yesterday, he asked me, like, from my perspective, what would be a successful session? And I said that probably, I probably said a couple things, but one of the things I said is that success would be not me asking you all questions and sort of going down the line, but more dialogue between all of the panel participants. So you are to imagine that you're in an intimate dinner. Maybe you have a glass of wine or a beer and you're talking to each other. But I want you to, if you would, join me in thanking the participants. Okay, and we'll get rolling. And I think where I want to start is kind of picking up from the last session that, again, had pretty dour results about sort of all the negative implications of COVID and the degree to which students are recovering. But think about whether there's anything coming out of COVID, anything that looks like an innovation that we might want to hang on to. So I don't know where to, I don't want to sort of go person by person, but I think, Mohammed, I'm gonna just start with you. And if folks want to react to some of what Mohammed says, then just jump in. Yeah. So, and Mohammed, I don't know if green is on.
All right,
Yeah.
there you go. All right, innovation, right? As someone who's been has had that on my title, I'm originally, I always say for me, innovation is bringing back throwback ideas that have always worked, but now implementing them properly, right? I mean, it is, right? If you look me up, I attempted desegregation in Texas, throwback idea. And I think we still need to attempt that, frankly. And, high quality school day tutoring has become, all the cool kids are saying it now, right? Tutoring. And we know you can do it in a crappy way. We know all these vendors are popping up and trying to make a whole lot of cash. And we know how you can do it well, right? And so and I'm probably not going to answer your question, but the innovation of bringing that back to the forefront and doing it well. And teachers can't just do it themselves, right? Like I literally have advocates every day now that I'm in the seat. Advocates are my friends, but they are also, yeah.
All of
You're not doing enough to do high quality school day tutoring, as if it's just easy to pull off, right? You got to restructure the school day. You got to pull out 3 kids. You got to find an adult who's trained, who has to reinforce the main curriculum that they're learning every day in tier 1 instruction, right? As if it's easy to pull off, right? You can throw bodies at it, but you got to actually do it. Even grabbing college kids, you got to train them up. Right. And you got to restructure the day too. You got to make sure how to pull out kids and things like that. So this obsession right now about it, I like it. And I hope that we perfect it in this country, especially for our urban and rural poor children who need it the most. And so I want that to stick around, and I want us to all obsess about it. You're hearing states do a tutoring corps, right? We should go full force on this, right? Service corps style, but again, doing it well and understanding that it takes, but truly, if we really want to get the best instruction, teachers are going to need that support. And yeah, you can use teachers, but you can use other trained adults as well. I've seen studies where even volunteers can have a positive impact without even paying the tutors. Second, I am excited about people disrupting the conversation around teacher licensure and what that looks like. I know Massachusetts will have a conversation about that. I don't think it's the only pathway to gatekeep to bring someone into the profession. I ran HR divisions, turned them around for very low performing school systems. And I've seen teacher come in through conditional and kick a traditionally trained teacher's butt. And I've seen people come in the other way as well. But there's a lot of support
what
needed.
you mean by the disruption?
Yeah, I mean,
sure
licensure exams is not the only way to determine whether a teacher is going to be of high quality or not, and their predictive value. And I know Dan and team have done a lot of studies, and we need to look at other things as well. But if you're going to do that, induction has to be very powerful, right? Those first 3 years, and I would argue even 5 years, right? Having a mentor, master teacher identified for that teacher. I rather make induction high stakes. I rather have a new teacher come in, go through the first 3 years, and then a group of people deemed you are a professional teacher. And then I want that teacher to get a significant salary bump, not the lame $500 steps and lanes. And I hope we can also blow that up as well one day. Remember, I'm an urban school teacher. I need the best teachers because we tend to get the lowest tenured teachers and such, and high turnover. And so those 2 innovations, one is a throwback idea and doing that well. And then the second one is when I met Dan a while ago, and I said, I want to blow up licensure. And I'm getting to do that. And I also look to my colleagues in Massachusetts, Maryland Lives to talk about Massachusetts and all those comparisons and everything else. But the fact is they're both wealthy and they have a disgusting 40-point achievement gap that none of them have closed. So let's just leave it at that.
Now he's
And
gonna
so,
talk to you.
yeah, so
Keep in
yeah.
tag, Claire.
So I'll just stop there. Remember, I grew up in California. I'm an LA kid. I went to Texas for 10 years. I could only have dreamed of the per pupil of the East Coast. And now I'm like, man, what can we do with this? So I'll just stop there. Recording is stopped, right?
I did ask Dan if this was going to be recorded. I was like, is this going to be a safe space or? Yeah, our achievement gap's terrible and we need to talk
Recording has been stopped.
and we need to talk more about it. I'm gonna take the gauntlet and start with licensure and our pipeline work, because I think one of the clearest policies that emerged from the pandemic in Massachusetts was the emergency license. Several states did some version of an emergency certification or alternative certification during this period of time. And we did so as well in the spring of 2020, when we realized that we had a large number of prospective teachers who couldn't complete their licensure exams. I'll talk about that again in a moment too, because all the testing sites were closed. And so they literally weren't going to complete their licensure requirements. So we got the emergency license passed with that as the primary objective. And what we quickly learned was that it opened the door not only to those almost teachers who were able to use it and go get a job, but it opened the door to a lot of prospective teachers who didn't have classroom experience, who might otherwise not have entered the profession. So we have extended the emergency license several times. We currently have 2,500 teachers working on an emergency license, and they are significantly more racially and ethnically diverse than our overall teacher population. And we're doing an evaluation of the license in general. The majority of them want to stay. They did not do this on a whim because they needed a job, but they are really invested and dedicated to this profession. We also know that they are more likely to be in urban or low achieving districts. And so there's a lot that comes along with thinking about how to support these educators. In order to get an emergency license, you needed a bachelor's degree, and that was pretty much it. So high quality induction mentoring is now a requirement to even extend it by a year. And then there are limits by which you have to have advanced to a provisional or an initial within a certain period of time. But it really has opened the door to us on different ways to think about inviting people into the pipeline, into the profession. And some people have shared personal stories. I have 3 children, and my 4th grader is in a classroom with an emergency licensed male educator of color who is doing magical things in this classroom. And one of the immediate barriers he ran up against was, as student enrollment declined this year, he was the first person on the chopping block. And the district had to figure out how to get around the collective bargaining agreement to keep him on staff. So if you want to talk about also policies that need to change, it's that last in, first out policy as we think about diversifying the profession. How do we keep the very educators we're trying to invite and support into the
Did
profession?
the district get around it?
They did, and I don't know how. That's the extent of my insight into he's there. Thank God. So that's one of the biggest licensure shifts that's come out. And so we're learning from this, and we're trying to think about how to integrate what we learn into our licensure policies. The licensure assessments themselves also, this was something we started before the pandemic, but and I'll talk about innovations to me are actually more about the urgency the pandemic has brought to things we already had in place. And the pandemic brought more urgency to the ways we think about expanding and diversifying the pipeline and providing alternatives to traditional licensure assessments. So we have an MTEL alternative assessment pilot underway. We just were on Tuesday, hopefully officially extending it by a year. But we currently have 21 approved alternative licensure assessments in Massachusetts that we're studying. So that's another innovation that I hope will become permanent as we emerge from the pandemic and think more broadly about licensure in Massachusetts. I'm going to pause, and I have other notes, but I want to open it up more to the panel and see what else people recommend or would push us on.
If Rick or Andy, you want to chime in. I was going to take us in a slightly different direction.
Well, I'll give us three. I hope we do come back to the teachers. I just think three real quick ones. One, we used to be called unbundling. We're calling it a Bellwether assembly. I think a genie that's out of the bottle is this idea of like building more customized supports around parents. And so much of this stuff, every narrative about it turned out to be wrong, like pods and what was going to happen with that and what parents want. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. And I don't think that's going to go back in the bottle. Second, it's hard to miss. And I do hope we talk about, particularly with we got someone from Maryland on the panel. We got Rick here. Now known as Rick from this morning. Do we talk about finance? Like it's hard to
We
miss
have not talked about finance yet.
the two things that are moving a lot around the country are choice. There's been an enormous explosion in choice, really remarkable the last couple of years. And also finance reform is happening. And that's both as it traditionally does in the courts, like we just saw in Pennsylvania, but also stuff like, Maryland, Illinois, a number of states have made reforms. And I think that's worth paying attention to. And then the third thing is the transparency. And people don't like to talk about it, but parents got a good hard look in schools and they didn't like what they saw in a lot of cases, how time was used, what was taught. And this tends to break down along ideological lines, but in fact, on both the right and the left, there was different, people saw that like history was being taught in a sterile kind of whitewashed way or being taught in a very sort of tendentious ideological way, and they don't like it. They don't like other stuff that was going on. I don't think that transparency genie, at least while this cohort of kids moves through schools, goes back in the bottle. And we should talk about that because there's probably both upsides and downsides to that.
So I first have to mention that you don't know it, but you're all part of an experiment. It's not a random assignment experiment, but it's how much of Rick can you take in a day? That having been said,
It's terrible, but we'll have lunch break. Don't worry.
So I like the discussions of licensure, but it strikes me that that's sort of a marginal change in what we've always been doing. And I believe in Catherine's edict that we're not going to squeeze much more out of changing the schools as they exist. She's not going to agree with me in the end. So, but I will give her credit for this. We have extensive information that on average, professional development does nothing. And yet we're going to push more professional development to deal with these problems. We have some, I think, fairly substantial evidence that licensure doesn't do a lot to ensure good teachers. But at the same time, just opening up licensure doesn't mean that everybody who comes in on alternate routes is good. And as long as we maintain a system in which once you're in the door, you're in the door, we're not going to, in fact, get a huge amount out of opening up licensure. I don't think we can say that we're dealing with what the media has said about shortages, maybe by eliminating some of the entry licensures. But there is actually, I'm the only person in the world who would suggest this, I think, a change that with the ESSER funds, we could eliminate the entire achievement gap. And that change is to use the more effective teachers more intensively today, pay them out of ESSER funds to work more intensively. And then with the ESSER funds that are still left over, because there's a lot of them, we can buy out the contracts of the least effective teachers. And if you did that, what we've all said forever is that the most important factor in schools is the effectiveness of the teacher. We would increase the average effectiveness of the teacher corps. We could eliminate these problems, and if we continued, set us up for the future for better schools than we had in the past. Now, the reason why nobody wants to talk about that is nobody wants to talk about changing our policies with respect to teachers, except Mohammed.
I was
who-
gonna say, I heard
except
him
mo-
say he wants to blow up the steps and
except
lane.
Mohammed, who was involved in the Dallas experiment that's ongoing, that is successful. By all the evidence we have, Dallas has dramatically changed what can be done, particularly in the worst schools, in the most disadvantaged schools, by insisting or providing incentives for really good teachers to work in the worst schools. And once you do that, it turns out that you can make better schools out of them. But these are things that we have Washington, DC impact program, which seems to be sort of going downhill a little bit as far as I can tell. I'm not sure. And we have Dallas, and then we have 13,452 other school districts in the country that aren't doing this. And so if we don't want to talk about any change from what we have now and want to add a few days at the end, we want to add a little bit more tutoring of the same people that are giving the instruction now, on average, we're not going to get much out of it. I guess that's why I'm here at the end of the panel, that nobody else wants to talk about these things.
Well, I think this is important, and we should, I mean, like, one thing that strikes you, go around the country, and one of the blessings of my job is I get to go around the country. Impact is widely regarded as a failure. And if you talk to leaders in our field, so these are leaders of the teachers unions, these are leaders of teachers colleges and stuff. These are the people who people look to for reliable information. They tell you impact is a failure. And that is absolutely at odds with the evaluations, multiple evaluations, using different methods. It's at odds with what we've seen with the labor market and so forth here. But that is the conventional wisdom. And that is like a stunning indictment of our sector and how information travels. And then I would just say more broadly, like, I think teaching is the place where the gap between the research and evidence and the literature and both practice and conventional wisdom is the widest of any sort of aspect of what it is we do. And I think we have to reflect on that. And like earlier, LIFO came up. And like, I mean, a lot of the circles I run in, if you are against LIFO, you're a bad Democrat, you're a bad progressive and so forth. But if you're serious about diversifying the teaching force, LIFO is an enormous obstacle. And arguably the progressive position is to get rid of it. And also it's obviously, as we all know, it's talent and effectiveness insensitive, would be to get rid of it if you're serious about you want to change representation in the teaching force. But we don't talk about any of this stuff. Honestly, the media is a huge part of the problem, and that might be something to talk about because it's one reason why I think parents are left like incredibly confused. And I will just say, like, I don't know if we're recording or not, it's an enormous abdication of professional responsibility on a lot of people's part.
Andy, I just want to push you a little bit on that because I mean, I agree with your assessment of impact in particular. That it is kind of astounding that it's viewed as a failure, and that's what I also tend to hear. So like, what is it that should be done that's not being done so that the right message about what the empirical evidence says?
I don't know. Other people have smarter than me. I think it's politics, right? I mean, look, pick an issue, and you can. We've in this country, we somehow created a Republican and a Democratic way to teach reading, and like generations of kids have suffered for that. And we're just now trying to correct that. It may end up being an overcorrection and then setting things back again. But the fact that like reading instruction has been like is one example. I think it's politics, and there's an enormous amount of pressure for people to sort of fall in line. And what we're starting to see is some evidence. There's some empirical evidence on this that among elites, they are now changing their views on education issues to fit with their political priors and commitments, which is a huge problem for two reasons. One, like when we've traditionally gotten things done on this sector, it's been the opposite. People have worked across and broken out of that. And second, it's at odds because the other evidence is parents are now more than ever saying they'll cross party lines to vote on education and they'll support different kinds of candidates. We're seeing evidence of that. So it's another example of how like the elite conversation and and so I think it's politics. I've talked enough, but that's my answer is it's partisan politics, which is sort of poisoning everything. But like, I also think phones are a problem for young people, so maybe I'm just susceptible to conventional wisdom.
Well, I was hoping this would be like a little more upbeat session, given the first one. So let me ask one other area where maybe there could be some lemonade out of lemons from COVID. Some of the analysis from the first session that Elise put up, and I think one of the other presenters suggested that most kids did a lot worse in the pandemic, but that wasn't universally the case. That there's some percentage of kids that did better. I think maybe you mentioned that, Rick. There was some percentage, I think it's about 10-11% of school districts. The achievement in those districts looks better than what you would have expected. So is there anything that we know about that? Anything to be learned? Do we think that there's a role for, as hard as crazy as it sounds, like remote, some remote instruction, digital tools? What do you all think? Like, I know there's the desire to snap back to normalcy, which is going back to like in-person, kids are in a classroom. But is there something to be learned from the pandemic online experiment?
Sure. I mean, it's here to stay, and you can deliver instruction synchronously and asynchronously. What I don't want it to happen is, what some of my districts this year asked for permission to do more asynchronous days to count as towards the 180. And in order to, the justification was, can we do asynchronous days to give our staff a day to plan, an extra day to plan? I see that as like band-aids. Like, you need to restructure the day to find time in the day to plan, like focus on that while taking away time from kids. But online learning at scale was a disaster, and we have decades of research. Texas has statewide virtual options and things like that. Yes, it works for some kids, but there's other socio political factors and other things around that context that helps that kid thrive in it. But I think in order for, like, for example, Tennessee has something for like AP for all, to be able to get AP courses and computer science to the most rural parts, because it's hard to pull a computer science teacher in a part of town that computer science folks don't want to live in. And so I think things like that we should definitely embrace and do, and not run away from and do. But there are tensions that also rub up against labor around that as well. Who's providing it? The vendor or a teacher who is unionized, etc. I've already had some of those tensions. There are groups of board members and assembly members who want me to push for a statewide model here. And well, I don't want to start a whole other, I don't want to be running a virtual district. I would do that in partnership with a nonprofit or university or a portfolio of vendors, but that rubs labor in the wrong way, because there's going to be staffed with people who are not. So it's here to stay, but it cannot turn into the reason to give into adult convenience for workload and other things. And I'm worried about some of that as well, if that makes sense.
I don't know if you happen to know the AP for all. Is that sort of disruptive of the normal employment contract where teachers are employed by a single school district? Like, are districts sharing teacher resources? How does it work?
The way they're doing it is it's through like a vendor partnership. And so, you have your big time vendors and they offer those courses that way. But there's nothing stopping to be able to take cross district. So I have 9 districts in the shore outside of the core, right? Maryland shore, and they're very small. One of them is a small high school districts, and they're able to share CTE courses, sometimes cross border, because you're not going to be able to build, right, say a whole new automotive shop, say in one high school district, whereas just less than a 30-minute drive, there is one in the other district, right? They're carved up 9 different ways. And so those are some examples of we should be doing. And I think we should be creating policy conditions to allow trust me, I'm happy about crossing borders. We can do that, but we gotta make sure there's incentives and such in place to allow kids to be able to do those things. But it's so hard because we have all these ridiculous gates and stuff that ultimately make it harder for parents to exercise like choice and options across borders, because people are just fighting over resources and things like that. Yeah.
So I think that there is some lemonade in the expansion of remote instruction. I mean, you see Silicon Valley got geared up when it looked like there was going to be a huge continuing demand, and I think produced some good things. What I think we've also seen is there's a lot of heterogeneity in schools and in the response. On average, I don't think there's any dispute about in-class instruction is on average better than hybrid instruction is on average better than remote instruction, but there's a lot of heterogeneity in each of those categories. And it's finding a way to make better decisions that aren't, we do it for all of Maryland or we do it for all of Massachusetts, where the heterogeneity comes back to bite you.
Do we have a structure, do you think, that where we can learn from innovations and the learning spreads in positive ways? And I would just, I don't know, Andy, maybe this is directed to you, because I guess I would juxtapose it against what you said about impact. Like, if something worked, would we know it, and would we expect that it would spread?
You would expect a healthier, like, I mean, bad ideas beat out good ideas, inferior products beat out superior products industries every day. What's weird about education is it happens with such alarming regularity here. That should worry us. I guess, I think there is a difference. Like, if you've got something like a virtual option, or parents can opt into it, that's going to spread in a different way than a policy innovation like impact. Parents have no lever to choose impact, except through a very sort of sophisticated set of politics to change their local governance arrangements and so forth. So I don't think it's completely analogous, but I do think these other things, I was surprised when you said earlier, the earlier conversation was dour. I guess parts of it were, in politics are a fact of life, but like, I think transparency, choice, these are like good things. Like, I actually think these are like salutary benefits. And to your, so the core of your question, we don't keep two things in our head at the same time. The pandemic was terrible for lots of kids and families, both academically, mental health, general health and wellness, all of it. It was also really good for some kids. And like, people struggle to talk about that, but there are some kids who, what effectively was a default competency model that was created, they thrived under that. The online, some kids thrived under that. These big high schools, they don't work for every kid, and even like, you know, the small elementary schools, and for some subset of kids, they really don't work well, and it created new options. So I think that's all I think that's all for the good, and I hope we get to, you know, Rick said, you know, there's heterogeneity in all these populations. I hope we get to a more customized system, because there's a lot of kids who are sort of enduring rather than thriving, and I think this gives us an opportunity to talk about that.
In some ways, you all have mentioned like competency and some degree of personalization, and those are buzzwords that get used a lot in education, but it doesn't seem like in, you know, all the time that I've been paying attention, which is now 25 plus years, that we've really moved much in the direction of like competency based progression through the education system. Does anyone have a comment
Rhode
about that?
Island is I don't know if anyone here is from Rhode Island, but they're on their way. They just changed their whole high school model, and it's now, I don't know enough to speak thoroughly to it, but I feel like they're taking a step in that direction, where it's much more competency driven. They've gotten rid of the graduation requirement test and so forth. So I think that it's an interesting, hope we study it and learn from it and start to take some things away from it. The other model that's gaining a lot of attention is the apprenticeship model, that in many states is very competency based as well. So that's for teachers, obviously not for students, but how do we establish more of a track into teaching that's more competency driven and less standards driven or course driven and so forth. So I think that's an innovation that's coming out of the pandemic that I think could help build more local communities of teachers and around schools and so forth. So that's another one I would point to, and we're very interested in
Can I
it.
just ask you on that one? It seems like the hard part of that is what to do about the teachers that are not found to be competent. And that seems like
So
That seems like the rub. And I want to just say one other thing on this point. I believe that either you or Mohammed mentioned induction.
Yeah.
And I heard Rick say, professional development is a waste of money. And I don't know if you would put induction in that same bucket. But I wonder about how we sort of think about those issues.
I mean, the apprenticeship model depends on an approach to induction with a highly qualified mentor that follows you anywhere from 1 to 3 years while you are unemployed. So I think it's essentially taking all the benefits from a high quality induction and mentoring program and using it to develop a strong teacher. So
Yeah.
I don't think we've researched it a lot though. And that's one of your questions later, like, where do we need to know more? And I think that's one of the areas that we need to know more.
We get to redo induction as part of our blueprint for Maryland's future. If you guys have not followed Maryland's law, it's a massive law. Like, it is pre-K through 12, $3.4 billion over the next 10 years. Raising per pupil, looking at everything, setting a new college and career readiness standard. So one of the reasons I was intrigued to come, and it's one of these moments where like we get to look at everything all at the same time. Like for pre-K, it envisions a mixed delivery system. So that means private and public partnerships. Right, and apprenticeships. 45% of our graduates, by the time we're at the 10-year mark of implementation, should have an apprenticeship under their belt, or earned an industry recognized credential. So there's a lot of great things. And one of the things we get to do is blow up induction. But one of the things with induction is, she said, a highly qualified teachers, which is dependent on a system to be able to differentiate between a master teacher or not, which is things like impact and whatnot versus who has breathed the longest and for how many years. And so, there are teachers in their 7th year who could be a master teacher, and there are teachers who are in the 20th year can be a master teacher. In Dallas, we saw, and we took it statewide, and I saw the same thing in San Antonio, is when we had this differentiated systems similar to impact, our veteran teachers ultimately ended up cleaning house on the top tier performance, but there were outliers at the earlier part of the career. And those are the teachers we said, we want to give you a differential to come to the toughest assignments in the country and stay there, because you got to pay top dollar to be able to keep those teachers, because the assignment's not the same. I was one of those teachers, and I would have stayed longer if I knew that I could, be able to make more early part of my career. But induction is dependent on the ability to differentiate, to find the master teacher. And so induction falls apart.
We just need some evaluation.
Yeah, exactly. So induction falls apart if the master teacher is not the one providing a professional learning that is high quality. There's no better professional learning than sitting alongside a teacher who is watching you and coaching you every day and who knows what they're doing.
This also goes down to this whole, we talked about asynchronous, like I may differ a little bit. I think we do need more asynchronous time for teachers, and not just for them to work together and, everybody immediately when you say that, like, certain kind of person in our sector is like Japanese lesson study, which is all good, but teachers should just have some more flexible time to live their lives during the week. It's a really hard recruiting pitch if you're going to work from 7:38 in the morning to 2 or 3 in the afternoon. You're basically spending your weekends and evenings doing stuff that the rest of us do during the week. And I think this idea of how do you use teachers differently, master teachers, how do you structure the day? You could actually expand the school day and give teachers more flexibility. There's obviously costs involved in that, but we're incredibly unstrategic in how we think about staffing. There's the old joke about, if you came back, the 2 things you'd recognize are churches and schools, but there's some truth to that, right? And so I think there's an opportunity here to think about this completely differently, and how do you use teachers? And if you look at what the younger generation wants, out of a workplace, some of those things are not things that schools can accommodate, just in the custodial role that we have with kids, but some of them are things that we could accommodate. And there's just a sort of an enormous lack of imagination. How would you just do this like very, very differently? And obviously lots of constraints and obstacles, which are obvious. So we can.
One thing I'll call out to that, absolutely, I agree. Maryland, a part of the law has to implement a new career ladder where teachers are teaching part-time of the day and doing other leadership competency. Think about the old opportunity culture stuff, but on steroids. But Arizona State University is doing something interesting called Next Generation Workforce right now, where they're working with districts in Arizona and reimagining the school day and thinking about schooling both as a tapestry of teachers, volunteers, TAs, out of school time providers, etc. And everyone plays a part, and they're redesigning their day, their schedule, all those things around that. I'm very intrigued by it. So I've been thinking about what to do with some of my set aside that's left over. So I might want to, I'm never gonna get this money back. So I gotta use it to blow up stuff. And so I probably shouldn't use that expression as Muhammad Ali or Choudhury, but I will definitely find a way to do that. Sorry, I can be sarcastic too. So yeah. So,
Well, okay, so you've all mentioned teachers and ideas that are connected to teacher evaluation in one way or another. And most people look at Race to the Top as having been a gigantic failure, at least I think a gigantic failure, and certainly the teacher evaluation part of it. Where do we go from here?
implementation is hard. Implementation is hard. Everything goes to die at implementation. Superintendents change, boards change. Literally volunteer school boards overseeing billions of dollars where 500 or so people vote. like we are, implementation is hard. There is a lot of great conversations. Yes, failure in terms of a scale, it didn't move. And again, you can debate on what that failure is and not. But disruption in terms of rethinking about what evaluation should look like and what observation should look like. Lots of success there in pushing the conversation. Sometimes the success is breaking something, not necessarily, and then you got to build the quality around it. So I think that conversation was there, but yes, we could easily retrench back because you look at the current US Department of Ed compared to the other department, there's a whole different vibe. But I wouldn't call it a massive failure, but implementation is hard. And most folks tend to suck at implementation and including State Department of Eds and stuff. And we should be obsessing more about implementation science and how to do those things well and whatnot. And I think the concept wasn't a failure, it was just the implementations a stunk in many places. Yes.
So
what do we?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, jump
So
in.
I wouldn't say teacher evaluation is a failure in Massachusetts. It is, in fact, and totally, when the pandemic hit and it was spring 2020, we went to the commissioner and we said, we think you should, we said, let's take one thing off their plate and don't worry about teacher evaluation this year. And it was our districts, our principals and our superintendents who came back to us and said, no, you can't, we have to do it. Because it's the one thing we have that allows us to make personnel decisions between that critical third and fourth year where teachers move into tenure or professional teacher status. And the vast majority of districts in Massachusetts still use the state framework for educator evaluation. And we can definitely talk about the variation in implementation and the quality, but it is the guidepost for how they support educators and how they define education or practice. And then the other thing I would say, we still see significant variation in performance ratings before that fourth year. So it still matters. It's still informing feedback and observations and so forth. Oh, go ahead.
No. Finish your thought. I'm wholeheartedly agreeing.
One of the things that came out of the pandemic though was if we weren't going to take it off their plates, we wanted to at least make it more meaningful. So we dramatically reduced the rubrics to what we felt were the most important parts of teaching during the pandemic, and we called them focus indicators. And frankly, we didn't think this would happen. We didn't think this would be a big deal, but it became a massive, many districts grabbed them, used them, provided these focus indicators to their teachers, to their evaluators. And it was the biggest uptake of our EdEval framework we've seen in years. I'm not saying our performance ratings have changed, those still look flat and everybody's proficient or exemplary. But anecdotally, we're hearing that targeted definition of practice that met the needs of the time mattered. So we've continued to use those. And then we can talk more. Dan and Calder are working very closely with us to rethink what effective practice is now, beyond test outcomes, beyond just a teacher's value add.
And you'll hear a little bit more about
Ben's
that
going to
in
talk
next
about it
session.
later. I told Ben, I was like, Ben, I'm going to give him a little preview. But how do we define teacher quality outside just test-based outcomes? What are the non-test-based outcomes that matter? And particularly, how does a teacher's impact on a student's experience in school matter? And the study that we're doing with Dan and his team is looking specifically at outcomes for students of color, because that 40% gap is not good. So let's stop looking at those highest achieving kids who are predominantly white and high income, and start looking at how do we move the needle and how do we support students of color. And that's changing our educator evaluation rubrics, and it's changing the standards that we're writing for our teacher prep programs. So that's the other thing that is a little bit under the radar in Massachusetts, but systemically, I feel could have a big impact in how we define effective teaching over the next 10 years in Massachusetts.
Dan, like my colleagues, I would dissent from the idea that race to the top was a failure, and
I'm just
yeah.
for clarity, I'm saying it's, I think, regarded.
Yeah.
In the same way that perhaps.
Fair. And I'm not an Obama Kool-Aid drinker. I think they made some mistakes that have led partially to where we are. We can talk about that, but I think the thing but I think race to the top, and there's a bunch of things, including objectively the standards that are in front of the teachers are using, and kids are better now than they were, and that's a part of sort of the ripple effect of that. But on the evaluation thing, and there's a lesson there that I worry is about to happen on reading. Like, we went from literally evaluating pretty much no one. Like, I mean, you know, if you go back and read the new teacher projects widget effect report, like evaluation was not a thing. Anyone who knows anyone who taught or taught themselves, you got the, you know, the AP stuck his head in and was like, you've been evaluated. Like, because people, it was a paperwork game, right? In most schools. And we decided, let's go towards evaluating everybody with little attention that most people are in non-test. For all the talk about testing, the majority of teachers were in non-tested subjects and grades and so forth. And so it was just like going in just a couple of years from nobody to everybody. I mean, we wrote a paper about it called The Hangover, because that's what it sort of was. People were like, let's do this. And then it was like, so that's the implementation point, but like, it's even more than that. It's just the appetite was too big. And I say that because I worry again on reading. You know, we've gone from a couple of years ago, according to NCTQ's data, about a third of teacher colleges were teaching teachers how to teach reading based on the best available evidence. Now it's at about half. So we're moving in the right direction, but states, everybody's now doing science of reading. And we may be again about to, like, we should be careful of our appetite, or you end up sparking a backlash. And I think that sort of eval lesson is out there and should be heeded.
And it didn't change teacher assignment policies, though. At the end of the day, sure, you're evaluating, you found an amazing teacher. How do I get them to Southern Dallas or South LA or East San Antonio? Like, that didn't change. Like, they didn't say race to the top and make sure your highest performing teachers also create a amazing bonus or whatever structure to pay those teachers like rock stars.
Well, it did in a few places, but
in a
as you
few,
say,
but not for the country,
systematically.
right?
Yeah.
Because if we really want to move the needle in a country where that is fast diversifying and poverty is increasing, we need to get the best in front of them. So at the end of the day, that reform didn't really, there wasn't a mecca or billions of dollars thrown at that. So that's one thing I would say.
So it wasn't the evaluation per se, it was the use of evaluation that we didn't do. I mean, so I think if we did away with all of the evaluation today, we would have almost the same information from just observational information, that the principal knows, Mohammed knows what the other teachers in his school, who was good and who wasn't. Every teacher knows that. Most parents know that. And I usually add in that probably the janitor knows it too. I mean, but we won't use that information subsequently. And so we have all of this work on apprenticeship and we can evaluate them at the end. But if we don't use that information in our policies and our assignments, we have a very nice structure there that doesn't do anything.
I think that's true in general, but you did hear in the early days of eval, you talk to principals who would be like, yeah, I mostly knew, but there was a surprise, Miss so-and-so, Miss so-and-so. I was surprised how good they were, or in some cases, like those results. But I think I take your point. I take your point. I take your point in general. I do think there is this question of then what do you do with the information, which is a broader question we should probably talk about also, because I mean, we all lived through it. If we just had a good test and a good evaluation system, everybody would embrace it. Like DC is that thing,
Yeah.
and yet for some
Yep.
reason, and it's like if you do this long enough, there's like a Lucy in the football quality to it, right? It's always like you just do this and the money and everything, and then like the football gets yanked away. And it could be, one hypothesis might be that this sector is just kind of allergic to accountability and has a political structure that enables it to repel accountability. And so we get these things and then they don't actually get used in consequential ways. Because
Okay, that is the perfect segue to 2 speed round questions, and then it's going to open up to the audience. One is ESEA. Anyone have any thoughts about what might or might not happen, or are we just going to continue to go on not sort of reauthorizing?
This Congress? I think no, not anytime soon. I don't think something's gonna happen around there. I'm not hopeful that ESEA somehow is gonna open some amazing policy or unlock something right now. I'm just not. I'm just gonna be, I think everything's gonna happen at the state and local level in terms of reforms. And that's where the leadership is gonna have to be. And then those proof points force the feds to ultimately say, change this, make this better. And so I'm not hopeful right now there's gonna be some kind of amazing reauthorization that opens up something or things like that. You know, is ESEA gonna open up and say, hey, all states must submit an amazing plan on how they're gonna get master teachers in front of the poorest kids in this country, or else we will hold your title money hostage. I'm not hopeful that's gonna happen right now. But that would work.
But ESSA took away much of the potential pain to school districts that was in NCLB. And so nobody's complaining. I mean, are they? I might be wrong, but I don't think anybody's complaining about it. Why would you ever reauthorize this? There's no push to do that.
Okay. Last question, and Andy, you said that one of the consequences of the pandemic is that a lot of parents got a window into what was going on in the classroom and didn't always like what they saw, so that there was more transparency. But one of the things that came up in this morning's session was the low take-up by parents, of pandemic, recovery programs. That, and at least one theory for that is that parents don't actually know where their kids stand. So those feel like a little bit at odds. Does that?
Yeah, and because we're not honest with parents, why wouldn't they be confused? You've got signaling from school in terms of grades and so forth, which are not necessarily a reliable metric. You have very few states who are trying to like aggressively level with parents. And when you do, it turns into just a political goat rodeo. I can tell you in Virginia, we have tried a bunch of different ways to let parents know we had the biggest drops on the NAEP of any state, right? Confirmed also by our own state assessments, confirmed also by third-party vendor assessments that are in wide use around the Commonwealth. And we're still arguing about whether this is an issue every time we do it. I mean, to the point, I'm an AIR, should probably be careful. Like the commissioner of NCES, like went in the Washington Post and pushed back on it because it was Glenn Youngkin. I mean, it was crazy. It was so over the line, but yet that's like business as usual now. And so why would parents, and I think they just sort of tune out because like, it just sounds like people arguing when in fact, like we're trying to tell them like something really serious happened. These are averages. We don't know your kid. But you should be trying to find out. And you should be paying attention to this. And it's just a complete political circus. One of the more frustrating things that I've seen just because the stakes are so high for kids and there is a lack of urgency in a lot of quarters. You hear, well, they'll bounce back, kids are resilient, and like all those things are sort of true, but there's like a cohort of kids who this is, I mean, Rick's done a lot of work documenting like the macro impact of this, who this is really bad for. And there is this sort of que sera attitude, or that it's politics. We can't let people like impugn the schools. And we made mistakes. Like it's clear. I mean, you can't look at those NAEP results and be like, okay, wow, like That was just random. Like we are at the tail end. And we've got to be able to talk about that. We got to be able to talk about honestly and what we're going to do to make it right. But it's all so hyper political. And this, by the way, is my second time on the state board. So I've seen this before, and it was political the first time. The first governor appointed was Mark Warner, and the Republicans were hot to trot to stop him because everybody thought he was on his way to being president. It's like another level of intensity now. And I think that's just because like politics have changed in the intervening years. So I think it's not surprising to me that parents are both confused and exhausted and just trying to live their lives. They don't obsess about this stuff like we do. And we've just done a poor job sort of meeting them where they are.
Okay, well, we did not get to all of the questions, but I want to make sure that the audience gets a chance to ask questions. But before I hand the mic over to someone, does anyone have something burning that they want to say?
I have one thing. I recently injected something into the press and the media, and it's been interesting to see how people react. And of course, some of it fell under political lines. There was the Fox version and then Baltimore Sun version. You know, we had, you know, like many states, we're rebounding in literacy, and then math is ugly right now. And we have proficiency rates that are like, for example, 5th grade, 25% of kids are proficient in math. Literacy is actually higher than pre-pandemic in many grades, and including across subgroups. So that is great to see. Yep. And so, and then of course the press wants to, is that the science of reading training, right? People want to simplify things all the time. I'm sure it's a factor. But one of the things that I did, because I'm a huge data person, remember, I worked in low performing schools facing state takeover. You know, in Texas, he's the most powerful commissioner. He can replace your board with one F-rated school for 5 years. I know him well. He's a friend because he was my board member during our Dallas era of reform, Mike Morath, a good friend. And basically, one of the things we would do is look at kids who weren't proficient more closely, right? And you had to, you know, you could project and you can look at those things. 49% of kids were level 2 in 5th grade math. And of those, a large chunk, I'm talking a large chunk, like close to over 30, were on the cusp of proficiency, 3 questions away. They got 60 to 80% of the questions right on that test. Are they failures? Is that a failure? Right? Like, and then when I said, I made a phrase in the board meeting, I said, it isn't all gloom. And of course, Fox said, state superintendent said, it's not all gloom, you know, because I didn't say it's a failure. And, you know, they like picking on Baltimore City a lot. And teachers did some work to get that there. Now, of course, all of a sudden, one of my teacher board members says, well, we can't teach to the test. Maryland prides itself as having the lowest set of questions, giving a lot of time back, having open response questions. I think our AP science test is an AP test in disguise, frankly, and our algebra test is really a reading test. But like, that's a test you might want to teach to, right? We said that a lot during conference. But 3 questions. How many of us got a B in college? Are you a failure? Like, you know, like, and we need to talk about, right, doom and gloom and failure differently too. And I would appreciate more out of the sector around that, especially as someone who worked in high poverty districts where going from 20 to 30 to 50 to 60 was kicking the butts of suburban districts who were just riding off of socioeconomic status. That's the only thing I wanted to get out. I'm sorry.
No, that was good.
Yeah.
That was good. All right, I know I handed the mic. Yep.
Hi,
Sorry, can I just say before, there's a second mic floating around somewhere. Does someone have a second mic? Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Ashley Brizzo with the U.S. Department of Education, and appreciate the state perspective on innovation. And Dan, your contextualizing of ESSER as, you know, we have opportunities, but also limitations to those opportunities. And you're following around, like, how is evidence informing sustaining those innovations? So just curious what thoughts are around how do we keep some of the good nuggets and the lessons learned of what does work going. At the department, I run the Education Innovation Research Program. So yeah, it's $284 million for this year of funding, but we funded 28 grants last year. Like, we can't absorb all of that, but what are some other opportunities. Obviously, we're not the only grant making organization, but even all of those taken together don't equate to what has been invested via ESSER. So is that implementing it in state and local budgets? There's not a ton of room there. So how else to keep the good stuff going?
And let us know if it's the question is directed to anyone in particular. Okay.
Want to take it?
This is just two things I would say. One is, and this came up earlier this morning, supporting data systems. Like, we have to continue to track what's happening, but with both our students and our teachers. So data systems, I think, from my perspective, are worth the investment. If you were to think about a long-term investment in just supporting evidence-based decision-making. The other thing, and this is just like what's happening to us right now, is our Title IIA dollars are going away, and all of the work that our center does is people. So it's not flashy, but it's sustainable. It's the work that we have done is long-term investments in coherent policies and strategies, and we can't do that without people. So those are the two things I would say.
So could I just add a footnote to your statement? I mean, partly right now, we're in an era where people are resisting testing, and there's movements to cut back on testing. There's parallel movements of many states to resist having anybody use their data on performance and to evaluate things. And so along the way, there's this movement toward, I guess, lack of transparency that I think is virulent. And that if you want to keep these things going, you have to ensure that the funding that goes out for state data systems has a little clause in it that the data have to become available.
Great.
Broader issue on the lack of transparency is not just this stuff. Like, I think what's happening with ESAs around the country is really interesting, and it's going to be interesting to watch, but very hard to evaluate right now because of the way these things are being set up. And so it's going to be there's a sort of lack of transparency across the board. And then I think collectively this community should be trying to push through. The other thing, this is my editorial I always make, is please stop evaluating funding streams because it just confuses people. So like during the Obama years, the SIG program, like as I read that, like light touch evaluations bounce off of low performing schools, really intensive evaluations can help. But on the average, and so people are like, oh, turning around schools doesn't work. Title I, this is like a long story of Title I evaluations. And that we've got to get more nuance. And this is going to be true. You can see with the ESSER money. I mean, I don't believe the ESSER money was deployed responsibly. I know that I'm not the only person who has that view, but it is what it is. But we're going to get back to evaluations. Oh, we spent 190 billion during the pandemic and didn't get anything for it. That is not helpful. We need to there needs to be much more nuance there in terms of what worked and what didn't.
Sonny, hang on 1 second. Just one other concrete thought about the SLDS program. States, as part of their performance metric, you could say we're going to look at how many academic publications cite using the data from Massachusetts or Washington or wherever to try and create some alignment in the incentives of the people who are putting the data together. Because I don't think it's enough to say that the data are accessible, because it's easy sometimes for states to say, well, of course it's accessible, but like, what kind of data is it? And how easy is it to get the data? And all of those things matter. Sonny.
So Helen Ladd again. As I think about the combination of the learning losses and education losses related to COVID and the effects on the economy, not of those losses, but just of everything connected with COVID. I try to think about lessons. One of the lessons you haven't mentioned today, and I would have thought that would be the importance of getting support staff in schools to work with teachers, to work with students, to provide bus drivers in North Carolina to get kids to school, all of these support staff. So I'm talking about teacher assistants, I'm talking about psychologists, I'm talking about social workers. And I haven't heard any of you mention anything about those support staff, which are in increasingly short supply in many states.
We're going all in on community schools. But community schools in and of itself is not going to close the achievement gap. You have to do wraparound services. Well, trust me, as a child of poverty, as a teacher in I always say I was a damn good teacher in South LA because I was a damn good social worker, but that's not sustainable, right? I shouldn't have to be social worker. I shouldn't have to keep a food pantry in my classroom, etc. I shouldn't have sharpened pencils and so I can just give out pencils every day. But that's what I did because I needed them to learn and focus. But so we're going all in on community schools. We're literally giving a personnel grant. They have to hire a community school coordinator, have a full-time healthcare practitioner, and as well as a permanent per pupil bump to do the full service community schools model. But that in and of itself is not going to ensure that the teacher knows how to deliver, say, science of reading, aligned instruction, etc. But it will allow the teacher to focus on that. So I'm with you, and I can go all on day about that. But I also have this problem of schools becoming more and more the place where social safety nets and our failure to deal with poverty in this country is what gets solved. I'm so tired of that, right? You know what? You want to help close the achievement gap? Yeah, make the child tax credit permanent or something, right? Right? Kids will learn. I promise you that. It will help with family and stable homes and things like that. It's not a panacea. But my point is, like, schools are becoming the place to excuse the failure of safety nets in this country and how we deal with poverty and everything else. And that's a problem. And now, like, just throw more wraparound services. And I'm all about wraparound services, but I'm also all about the teacher who knows how to teach. And if you ask me what dollars I wanted at the end of the day, I would want the teacher who knows how to teach versus if I were fighting over resources. Obviously, I would want both. But if you ask me, I would want an army and master teachers at that school versus if I had to trade off. Margaret Rose often talks about trade-offs. That's where I would make my trade-offs. And oftentimes that's the position we are putting our schools in. Maryland is not, but I feel like Maryland needs to have that other side of the conversation about teacher quality and preparation as well.
But it doesn't seem like it's a trade-off. I mean, as Dan points out, we had $186 billion of ESSER money going to the schools that I think a large portion of it is still sitting there that could have been used. I mean, do you have some ideas, Sonny, on why schools, if this is such a valuable way to improve instruction, why schools have not used some of these funds to hire that way?
You know, all I know is from having looked at North Carolina data during the Great Depression, the state of North Carolina cut way back on teacher assistants. That was the thing that was easiest to cut back on. We didn't want to cut back on teachers, but teacher assistants mattered. And the other things mattered, especially post-COVID period, when lots of kids are coming to school with all sorts of family challenges, having dealt with other issues. So I don't have good answers.
In Massachusetts, the top two vacancy roles are paraprofessionals and substitutes. And people don't want the jobs. I mean, districts are just fighting over paraprofessionals. They're poaching, which has never happened before. It's just
You can make more at Amazon.
right, exactly, because there's the pay.
3.4%.
Exactly. No, so and then substitutes are even worse, and the demand for substitutes is even higher because because teachers are taking more time off, whether for health reasons or personal time, and so it's a huge problem right now that you know, the good news is we're seeing para salaries go up. Like, it's finally forcing districts.
Bus driver salaries are going
Yeah,
up.
so they're finally like getting a bump up in these salaries, which is terrific, but it took that.
Rick, you had your hand on the button.
No, I
Okay,
was just going to say, economists don't understand shortages. I mean, there are not as many people as we would like at the wages currently offered. And, you know, in this whole area, the shortage of these other people presumably is a function of whether you pay more than Amazon. And
True, bus driver.
Same with bus drivers. That doesn't seem to like a national shortage in some sense. Maybe it is at the current wage.
Charlie Clotfelder.
Oh, no, sorry, Charlie. You're net after Hannah. Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie. Hannah Putman, National Council on Teacher Quality. So I wanted to ask about this idea of opening up teacher licensure. And we've heard a few times the idea that we can't squeeze any more out of schools under current situations than we're currently getting. Although given NCTQ's research on teacher preparation, I might quibble with that. But I'm concerned we could end up getting less out of our schools if we start lowering the standards for a teacher. So if we're looking at a lot of states that are dropping requirements to become a teacher, especially dropping assessments of whether they know how to teach math, and now we're seeing states doing this with reading, often without putting anything else in place. How do we open up teacher licensure without putting kids at risk more, especially knowing that it is kids of color and kids living in poverty who are most likely to get those novice teachers who now are going into the classroom without having proven that they know how to teach reading or that they know math?
I know NCTQ is not letting go of its love of licensure. I know that. And trust me, I see it all the time. And trust me, one of the things being in Maryland is everyone who's like a reformer lives very close to me. So whether it be Mike, Petrelli, and Kate, everyone's there. So everyone has an opinion.
Heather Petsky lives down the street from me.
Yes,
So.
yes. So I know they're sticking to their guns, but at the end of the day, you've heard some of the rockstar researchers say its predictive value is mixed. And so I challenge the notion that we're somehow putting children at risk by opening up licensure as a district official who's had to do alternative prep and other things and see rockstar teachers. At the end of the day, to me, building a better teacher, to use that one book that came out a few years ago, was it Elizabeth Green? I forget who it was, but to build a better teacher, it's those first years. Right? It's those first 3-5 years and that induction experience. At the end of the day, I can be book smart, but I still have to deliver high quality instruction. I had some amazing TFA colleagues and I had some colleagues get the hell out of the classroom. You should not be in the classroom, but great, you got a perfect score on licensure. Do not be in the classroom. One of them was my groomsman. And so now he works for Google. Thank God. I'm glad he used that little blurb to get interview points. And so, but at the end of the day, I'm with you. Absolutely. It's not just open up the gates. I want to make induction high stakes. I want to make performance assessments high stakes. So at the 3-year mark, you have to demonstrate that you are a high quality teacher based on observation and all those things, or else you don't get to hold on to your job. But I also want to put a legitimate master teacher hanging out with that teacher those first 3 years. And I also want that teacher to get like a $15,000 bump when they cross over the professional. So I'm not saying it's there yet, but I want to do all those things. But because I'm not there yet fully is not the reason for me to just hang on to licensure completely. I am a fan of licensure for content and other things. Dan's research has shown that for elementary. But at the end of the day, most of your career and everything that you're going to do is going to be groomed in those first 5 years, especially those first 3. So that's how I would want to put all those other things around it, but I'm not going to just say licensure will save us just because I know too much as a district person on the ground.
I just want to agree, but also underscore the role of content. I mean, we
Yeah.
cannot let up on our expectation that teachers know their content. Because we know just from everything that Calder has done, and we know decades of research show that if you don't know your content, you can't identify when a child is demonstrating a misperception or is and that's just that's like baseline to me. And then I agree. I think like a lot of the nuance and sophistication and skill building happens in the field. And like we're doing really interesting work building off stuff you've done in Washington on like the role of the mentor teacher, the supervising practitioner in establishing those particular skills going forward.
That's a lot easier in single subject. Elementary teachers, we want them to know a lot about everything. And so, and then they come in with a bachelor's and then we take these subject tests. They took a couple of courses or crammed, right? Good SAT takers crammed and passed the subject test. I love NCTQ. I want them to exist forever because they have had a really good effect on teacher prep because they were some of the most unaccountable people out there. And so I love what they have done. And I do dig into when you guys profile, look at these teacher prep programs, getting candidates of color to pass licensure exams. But you know what the theme is when you really dig into them? They're literally test prepping the heck out of them to pass that test. They are literally mapping their courses and everything else. And if they don't pass it, they help them pass that test. So yeah, we could do that, right? But I would love to see the follow-up studies on those teachers and their value added and everything else. So so it's not complete yet, whether or not those teachers are effective.
Charlie.
All right, to jump in earlier. This has been a magnificent panel. I just think it's really been great. It struck me as I listened to you all as that you all are doing heroic things with not enough money. And several of you have talked about
Oh, I have money.
have talked
Yeah.
about the value of or higher wages, what they would be. And some economic studies have traced back the distribution where teachers rank in the distribution of all new workers from the 50s on. And we see that the median teacher keeps coming further down. And could it be, and this is not going to be a policy helpful question, but could it be that we're facing a country that doesn't want schools to be any better than they are, and that you all are doing the very best with the scraps that are there, and it's determined much more globally that these struggles are the result of voters.
I'll let you guys handle that one.
I would say, I mean, look, I'll say the uncomfortable thing, teacher pay in this country is highly varied.
Yeah, it
Like
is.
you in the county where we're in, which is right next to the county where Dan Goldhaber was a school board member, a tremendous improvement under his watch.
Right.
Right now, if you're married to another teacher and you teach for about 7 years, you're in roughly the top 5% of income in this country, which isn't a bad place to be. Now, look, it's a high cost of living area. Do you have a NetJet subscription? Probably not, but you're also. Private jet.
What Andy?
Yeah, exactly. I wish. Probably not. So like, could those salaries be higher, everything else, but like the idea that those people, are living paycheck to paycheck is that's a pretty good place to be. My wife's a public school teacher around here. You drive 45 minutes from here, where I also live half time, and you have salary scale to top out before that level if you teach for 20 or 25 years. Highly varied. And so and I think that's the whole story with teacher pay around the country. It varies. We tend to talk of it as a monolith. I think the conversation we're actually having in Virginia very explicitly right now. Virginia is one of 2 states we actually don't have an accountability system. Most people don't know that. We have an accreditation system for schools, which is very minimal. So we're having a conversation about what the accountability system should look like. And you're seeing this conversation play out other ways. It's a theory of action conversation. If we actually have meaningful measures of accountability and performance, can you then align resources to that and drive resources to where they're needed and so forth? Or is the predicate for having that system, you have to have a bunch of resources? And to some extent, that's a political question. I tend to think you can't just get the resources over time without demonstrating these things. Other people disagree. But that's, I think, the conversation we have to have as a country, because if you have a sort of low accountability, compliance-oriented system, outside of exceptional circumstances like the pandemic, which hopefully we don't experience again in our lifetime, it's hard to get huge infusions of resources for them. If you look, most of the big federal infusions, this goes back to like the Carter administration and his sort of landmark investments in Title I, and this is obviously No Child Behind. It's the Great Recession. It's what happened with the pandemic. It's these exceptional circumstances, and that we have to change that. So it's the average circumstances, and that we can build and make that case. And I think that's having good systems of measurement and pressure and so forth. Again, other people think the money's a predicate for that, and reasonable people can disagree, but I think those are sort of the table stakes right now in a lot of places.
All right, we have 2 more questions. Steve.
So I would follow up on Charlie's question, but probably from a different perspective. And that is, I was thinking perhaps before the session, it has been a great session, about the grand bargain, which is on average, teacher pay is probably far lower than it needs to be. And so the bargain would be that pay goes up, but serious evaluation goes up too. And you know, there might be an allergy to accountability, but there's probably more of an allergy to differentiated pay. And that differentiation would be very much a part of it, not only in the basis of effectiveness, but also, I mean, Mohammed really, you know, it was the first time I ever heard a teacher say about how important it was to be able to earn a lot of extra money working in a very difficult, you know, a school that's very difficult where they have a lot of extra responsibilities. And yet the most of the major organizations in the country seem also very much opposed to this. So is there any positive way forward?
Yeah, there's some hope. One of the, Texas has something called a teacher incentive allotment, built off of a depth of poverty measure that my team built in Dallas, San Antonio, and took it statewide. I never called my mom for anything because she's like, I don't know what you do half the day. And so I said, Mom, I got a bunch of Republicans to adopt a new depth of poverty measure. and essentially what it does is on top of base pay, you get allotments from the state, not wealth equalized. So a master teacher teaching, and the way we got it passed is urban Democrats and rural Republicans loved it because we had a rural adjustment and an urban adjustment. And so what you got to do is design what we called a teacher designation system. We didn't use evaluation, even though it's not unionized, the same forces play out. So teacher designation system, recognize exemplary masters, you design a system, you can design how you want. In the law, literally in Texas, we said, we can't force the state standardized test into your system, but we will validate it with Texas Tech. So Texas Tech has to validate the system. You can't have a bunch of master teachers at an F-rated school that's not going anywhere. So the teacher incentive allotment system now in its third, fourth year, I'm very proud of this. This is the work that I'm most proud of in Texas is basically you design a designation system, it gets validated by the state, and you submit your teacher designations. And if you teach at a high poverty, low performing school, you get $30,000 on top of base pay. And not wealth equalized. And if that and it's good for 5 years. So you can have an off year, right? But in that 5th year, you got to redesignate and you can always go up. But if you move when you got designated to Highland Park ISD, which is 0% poverty, it's a bubble inside Dallas ISD, right? They depend on us for the Whole Foods, but not the schools. And so where poverty is 0 and where even the superintendent gets an interest-free loan for $1 million so he can actually live there, that allotment drops to $5,000. I've never had so many suburban teachers line up for segregation until I had the ability to do that. So if we're not going to disrupt segregation, then give me the biggest edge to grab the very best. So there is hope.
Something you just said there is so important. The politics of this country are suburban driven, and on school finance, the suburbs are largely the problem, and urban and rural, that is the alliance, yet all of our politics augur against them finding each other and building that coalition. But that's the coalition if you want finance reform, if you want these things addressed. The political power is in the suburbs, and they hate this stuff. I mean, that's where No Child Left Behind went to die. That's like
Literacy's going to die.
absolutely. And so that is a big political problem that we have to figure out a way through. Yeah, literacy.
They just hire their tutors.
Right. Last question.
That's actually exactly what my question is about. I'm Allison Young. I'm from OSSI, the state education agency for DC. I was hoping I could get Mohammed to talk about desegregation.
I just stole someone from you guys. Tell Christina I didn't mean it's all it's fair.
All right. Yeah, so I mean, you teased segregation and desegregation at the beginning of your remarks, and you brought it up again now. I was wondering if I could entice you to speak about that a bit more, and also to put that, of course, in the context that schools are now resegregating, and you know, desegregation is sort of one of the only things that's ever.
It's a strategy.
Yeah.
It's a strategy. Massive court-ordered versions probably not going to come back, but it's a strategy. But we look at when NAEP achievement gap was narrowed the most. There were things going on, court-ordered desegregation. We look at where achievement gaps are lower, right? The elite self-proclaimed progressives of the East Coast, it's wider, and then in the South is lower. The backward South is lower, right? Like what's going on? I'm using words that people sometimes describe each other in, and
It's a safe space.
yeah, no, I just want to make sure. But at the end of the day, I used school choice to do integration in Texas. and people loved it. And those schools are thriving and they're some of the most sought after. And I brought the middle class back in with schools that are 50% poverty. And then I have been seeing a lot of great things from what's the Jeb Bush organization? Excel, yeah, where they're talking about disrupting borders. And I'm like, oh my gosh, look at that. I could, like, they're talking about let's disrupt. So school choice would be awesome if a kid had a chance to come into a high performing suburban school, if we were willing to do that. Is all the Democrats there down for that? You know, and I say Democrats. And so at the end of the day, it's a strategy. And I think we should not give up on it. And we should use things like school choice and other things to be able to do it. And we should also stop building housing in a backwards way. When I first came to Maryland, I lived in Columbia. He had a vision to create an integrated housing. If we did more of the country like that versus the way we pile on segregated housing, we would still have achievement gap, but it wouldn't be 40, it would be 10 within striking distance. And we wouldn't have rates of crime and other challenges. So let's not give up on that. And I would hope like there's a few more decades down where we could do housing differently and whatnot. You know, Urban Institute did this great study recently where a bunch of these borders and stuff are within the control of urban cities and school boards, and we don't need government intervention to do it and force it. And they're all sitting in blue cities. Yeah.
All right. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.